This government that's been in power for coming up to 10 years now is not going to be a source of great new ideas, usually.
So why on earth, after 10 years of liberal rule, should voters go back to the same old bowl of soggy cereal?
I think what's needed in Canada is a fundamentally different approach to growing the economy, to supporting, Canada's interests. Why would you trust them to change their minds all of a sudden?
A year ago, I sat down with historian Christopher Dummitt. He said something about Mark Carney that most people in this country dismissed. He said that a government in power for 10 years cannot reinvent itself, no matter who leads it. He said the problem wasn't Justin Trudeau, it was the machine that Trudeau ran. Carney won, the Liberals held power, everyone moved on. But I went back and pulled the numbers, not my numbers, not partisan numbers, Statistics Canada's numbers, the federal government's own fiscal reports, OECD's numbers, RBC's, Scotiabank's number. And what I found is not a political story at all, it's a structural one. This is the Revaluate accountability audit, 1 year since the reset that was supposed to change everything in our dear nation. Let's see if it actually did.
Economic challenge of Canada is to get the government out of the way and to kind of support and foster incredible competition and dynamism in Canada's economy with some fresh ideas. And I'm not the best person to come up with all those ideas.
So why on earth, after 10 years of liberal rule, should voters go back to the same old bowl of soggy cereal?
This government that's been in power for coming up to 10 years now is not going to be a source of great new ideas, usually. I think what's needed in Canada is a fundamentally different approach to growing the economy, to supporting, Canada's interests, to thinking Canada does have interests, thinking Canada does have a proud history. Why would you believe that this government, which has been against all those things, or it's at least a way of supporting all those things, why would you trust them to change their minds all of a sudden? Another way for the Liberals to win is to scare Canadians that Conservatives are too frightening. And this worked for Trudeau very effectively in 2019 and 2021. I think something has switched there. I think there's been a shift in our political discourse that is going to make that less convincing now, but we'll have to see. You need to kind of this anti-regulation approach. You need to get rid of all these things that are restricting the economy from growing, restricting police from being able to do their jobs, restricting Canadians from living the way they want to live. I think we've been living through a Victorian age. We're living through the 1970s to a certain extent. Incredible economic crisis. The old ways of doing things are ossified. We've had too much regulation. We've had, essentially this incredible growth of government, and we need to get rid of government.
That conversation happened in March 2025, and within weeks, Mark Carney was sworn in as the Prime Minister. Now, I want to be precise here because this is not a hit piece on Mark Carney. Carney has governed for roughly 12 months as of this recording. Some of what you're about to see is inherited from a decade-long liberal governance. Some of it happened under Carney's own watch. But either way, Dummitt's core argument wasn't about a person. It was about an institution. And institutions don't change because the nameplate on the door changed. So let's get into the data. Dummitt said the Liberals had no credible path to growing the Canadian economy. But here is what the data shows. Real GDP per capita, that number that tells you whether actual Canadians are better off, fell 1.3% in 2023, then fell another 1.4% in 2024, and another 1.2% drop in 2025. 3 consecutive years of declining living standards. That's not a recession headline. GDP growth looked fine on paper, but divided by the total population, and you see the truth for yourself. Canadians on average got poorer 3 times 3 years in a row. And it goes even deeper than that. Real investment in machinery and equipment, the productive kind that builds economic capacity, is still below 2008 levels right now. Canada has been pouring investment into real estate instead of real economic output. That's not a growth growth strategy that's a slow bleed in the kind that can make an economy hemorrhage to death. Canada's GDP per capita in purchasing power terms now sits roughly 27% below the top G7 country. That gap is not closing at all, and I'm sure you're familiar with that chart. Dummitt's prescription was simple: get government out of the way, reduce the state's footprint, foster competition. But here's what actually happened in those 365 days. Federal spending as a percentage of GDP stood at 17.8% in 2023 to 24. It's up from 16.9% the year before, and it stayed at 17.8% in 2024 to 2025. The expense ratio didn't fall. It didn't even stabilize, it rose and it held. Now, here is Carney's specific numbers. The federal budget deficit in fiscal year 2025 swelled by about $78 billion, up from $42 billion in the fall economic statement just months before. To put that into context, $78 billion is the highest peacetime deficit Canada has ever run since 1995, outside of COVID, outside of a recession. As a deliberate policy choice, that's the highest deficit Canada ever run in those decades. And the government abandoned its prior fiscal anchor entirely. Interest payments on federal debts now consume 10.5 cents of every revenue dollar that Canada makes, meaning out of every $100 in revenue in Canada right now, about $11 going to interest payments alone. Getting government out of the way, the government even got bigger. And this is where the number stops being abstract. Housing affordability from 2004 to 2024, a 20-year window that spans multiple governments and, in fact, multiple parties. Canada's home price to income ratio increased by over 80%. This is the single worst deterioration in housing affordability among all of OECD nations over that same period. The United States, by comparison, was essentially flat. As of Q4 2025, monthly mortgage payment still consumes about 52% of the median household income nationally. Forget about cities like Vancouver, that number is about 85%. These are not affordable housing statistics, these are housing crisis statistics. There's one honest concession worth making here, though. Affordability has improved for 8 consecutive quarters, the longest improvement streak on record in Canada. But you don't get credit for slowly recovering from the worst affordability collapse in your country's modern history. On household debt, Canadians owe $1.85 for every dollar of disposable income. That's the highest debt to income ratio in the G7. Every other major economy is less leveraged than us here in Canada. And real wages between 2019 and 2024, the bottom 80% of the income distribution experienced negative year-over-year real income growth in 2022, in 2023, 2024, leading to 2025. Every income quintile below the top pulled back inflation-adjusted spending, meaning people were choosing between buying groceries and paying their rent. Christopher Dummitt wasn't making a political prediction when he was making those statements in 2025. He was describing a structural pattern. Institutions don't self-correct just because the person at the top changes. They self-correct when incentives change, when the pressure becomes undeniable, when the cost of continuing becomes higher than the cost of changing. And in fact, when you make failure more painful, that is when systems course correct. Canada hasn't reached that threshold yet, or maybe it has and we're just watching it in slow motion. But what Dummitt described as the 1970s parallel is still worth noting today in 2026. That era ended with a fundamental restructuring of how Western governments thought about the state's role in the economy. It was a painful era. It was a disruptive era, and an era that eventually worked for most of the people in the Western world. The question for Canada in 2026 is not whether the reset happened or not. The numbers already answered that. The question is, how much worse does it have to get before the reset is real? Now that's Revaluate. That's the structural analysis that we tend towards here, not partisan loyalty, just the argument and the evidence which I've presented to you. If this made you think differently, I want you to tell me your thoughts in the comment section and answer for yourself. Have things improved for you as Canadian in those 365 days since 2025? Share this video with someone who needs to hear this analysis as well, and subscribe to the channel to support the effort and stay informed about future episodes. Well, I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.